문제가 되는 건데, 여성의 목소리가 없는, 여성의 참여가 없는 평화는 진정한 평화가 될 수 없다고 저는 확신합니다. 제 확신은 제가 지난 15년 동안 세상에서 가장 큰 여대에서 훈련받은 결과입니다. 여성의 말을 경청하고 여성의 참여와 리더십 아래서 평화를 이루어가는 것이 얼마나 소중한가를 제가 배웠기에 진심으로 말씀드립니다.
이제 우리 데스몬드 투투 종교와 사회정의센터 관장 역임하셨고, 젠더와 종교 학술지 편집장을 지내셨고, 또 장학사업에 많은 기여를 하고 계신 우리 사로지니 나다르 선생님을 큰 박수로 맞아서 발제해 드리도록 하겠습니다.
Good afternoon, colleagues and friends. I am grateful for the opportunity to share some reflections on my experiences of reconciliation in an apparently post-apartheid South Africa. And I say post-apartheid South Africa and apparently because when listening to the presentation of my colleague, the Reverend Salamuzi Mabuza, tomorrow, it will become apparent why we insist on using the word post in quotation marks in the term post-apartheid. So, and in fact, the question that was posed by my colleague on the panel prior to my presentation, what is wrong with reconciliation, is part of the question I also want to pose in my own presentation. So in this paper, I postulate a link between the socio-political and textual conceptions of reconciliation. And I use Todorov's narrative equilibrium theory to conceptualize the discursive dimension of reconciliation as a socio-political act. The narrative level is particularly important, and I would argue has a lot to teach us in light of the influence and authority granted to sacred texts such as the Bible. And so in this paper I compare a biblical narrative with a narrative from the not-so-distant past in South Africa to show how a rush towards reconciliation and perhaps sometimes artificial peace leaves wounded bodies in its wake. Hence I suggest that when we think of peace and reconciliation, a more embodied and feminist hermeneutic is required that enables genuine reconciliation rather than an abstract idealism based only on the need for equilibrium or balancing the scales. And so please indulge me in a rather lengthy reading of a biblical text, 18 verses of it. But I think it is important to stay with the text in its context in order to understand the point that I want to make. And so we read the first narrative from the book of Esther, chapter 2, verses 1 to 18, and I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint commissioners in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in the citadel of Susa under the custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetic treatments be given them. And let the girl who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This pleased the king, and he did so. Now there was a Jew in the citadel of Susa whose name was Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with King Jeconiah of Judah, whom King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had carried away. Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is, Esther, his cousin, for she had neither father nor mother. The girl was fair and beautiful, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai adopted her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in the citadel of Susa in the custody of Hegai, Esther was also taken into the king's palace and put in the custody of Hegai, who had charge of the women. The girl pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with her cosmetic treatments and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen maids from the king's palace, and advanced her and her maids to the best place in the harem. Esther did not reveal her people or kindred, for Mordecai charged her not to tell. Every day Mordecai would walk around in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and how she fared. The turn came for each girl to go into King Ahasuerus after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their cosmetic treatment. 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfumes and cosmetics for women. When the girl went into the king, she was given whatever she asked for to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she went in, then in the morning she came back to the second harem in the custody of Shazgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She did not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. When the turn came for Esther, daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had adopted her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who in charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was admired by all who saw her. When Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus in his royal palace in the 10th month, which was the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the other women. Of all the virgins, she won his favor and devotion, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great banquet to all his officials and ministers, Esther's banquet. He also granted a holiday to the provinces and gave gifts with royal liberality. One is tempted to say they all lived happily ever after, but they didn't. So in the previous publication, using a feminist literary lens, I argued that the text of this passage, Esther 2:1-18, should be read as what Phyllis Tribble calls a text of terror. While the text seems, at least on the surface, to be concerned with the beauty contest, I showed that it provides enough evidence, as in verse 14, to claim that the activities at the harem constituted more than a beauty contest. They constituted sexual abuse. Consider the verse. In the evening she went in, then in the morning she came back to the second harem in the custody of Shazgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She did not go into the king again unless the king delighted her, and in her, and she was summoned by name. So not only were the girls spending a night with the king, but their status changed from that of virgins to that of concubines. And the night with the king could be repeated if he called them again because he delighted in them. I showed how the text, through its literary devices of time and plot, compels the reader to follow its internal logic towards an understanding of equilibrium and reconciliation, so that the reader then does not readily perceive the abuse that is happening. And so I draw your attention to the diagram, Todorov's theory of narrative equilibrium. Because this theory, the diagram captures the way in which the reader is guided towards the narrative equilibrium. The text begins with a state of apparent peace. There's then a disruption. There's a recognition of that disruption. Then there's an attempt to repair the damage. And then there's a new equilibrium, and so it continues. And so in this text, what we find is a reconciliation of the textual disruption that has happened. The textual disruption that has occurred is the apparent disobedience of the first wife of the king in chapter 1. Queen Vashti refuses to parade her beauty before the king and his drunken friends, and thereby disrupts the narrative equilibrium. The narrative disruption must be repaired, it seems, and the way to do this, in order to reach a renewed state of narrative equilibrium, is to find a new wife for the king. Chapter 2 ends in this reconciling of the text, a repair to the disruption that has occurred with the crowning of Esther as queen. This narrative equilibrium foreshadows a larger narrative equilibrium that is to come, and that is the salvation of the Jews, whose lives are being threatened by the Persian Haman. For the Jews to be saved, Esther must become queen. Only then can narrative reconciliation happen. Therefore, as readers, we are pulled into the logic of the textual reconciliation. The bodies of the wounded women are sacrificed on the altar of a larger reconciliation. This reconciliation is patriarchal, the need for a new wife for the king, as well as national, the salvation of the Jews. Higgins and Silver succinctly show the dangers of this rush towards narrative reconciliation. They argue that analyses of specific texts, when read through and against each other, illustrate a number of profoundly disturbing patterns. Not the least of these is an obsessive inscription and an obsessive erasure of sexual violence against women and against those placed by society in the position of women. How is it that in spite of, or perhaps because of, their erasure, rape and sexual violence have been so ingrained and rationalized through their representation so as to appear natural? And so we don't see verse 14. The sexual abuse of the young virgins is erased from the text, as the reader is pulled toward the enticing goal of reconciliation and of narrative equilibrium. This almost naturalizes the abuse, as Higgins and Silver argue. So I take you now to another narrative, away from the Bible, and this time towards a more contemporary South African story, as I said earlier, in the apparently post-apartheid South Africa. So 2006 marked 10 years of the new constitution in South Africa, 12 years after the onset of democracy and 10 years after the Truth and Reconciliation Committee chaired by Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu. It is within this post-apartheid, post-colonial, and I use the term post-colonial as a chronological marker, not a theoretical construct, and in this reconciliatory context, that we have to understand the charge of rape laid against Jacob Zuma, then 64 years of age, and up until this year, the President of South Africa, by Kwezi, the 31-year-old daughter of his comrade in exile. And Kwezi is not her real name, by the way. So narratives are always partially constructed, and Kwezi's narrative is constructed from the media accounts, court records, and subsequent analyses found in books. Notwithstanding her vivid account of what happened in November 2005, Jacob Zuma, the former president of the country, was acquitted on 8 May 2006, and the court ruled that the sexual relationship between him and Kwezi was consensual. Incidentally, he was also ordained as a pastor soon after. The aim of relating Kwezi's narrative is not to debate the non-guilty verdict, but to understand the way in which Kwezi's body becomes erased and reinscribed as a site for political gain. In his reflection on the trial, Raymond Suttner puts it aptly. While rape per se, whether or not there was rape, cannot be assessed or explained by the political context, this rape trial, in all its complexities, can only be understood within this framework. The most significant elements of those surrounding events may have been the perception and suggestion amongst many that Jacob Zuma was simply the victim of a conspiracy hatched by President Thabo Mbeki. In other words, we can understand Kwesi's narrative only within the broader context of the post-colonial equilibrium established in post-apartheid South Africa, a context of racial reconciliation, or rather racial rehabilitation, where a reclaiming of black men as subjects and not as objects of violent discourses is happening. In this context, the post-colonial equilibrium is disrupted through the charges of corruption leveled against a man of the people. Then the gender equilibrium is disrupted through the rape trial. The debate in the public space was about Kwesi's wounded body only insofar as this wounded body was constructed and created according to the conspiracy theorists, so as to disturb the post-colonial equilibrium, so as not to disturb the post-colonial equilibrium that had been established. And so in terms of Todorov's narrative equilibrium theory, stage 4 that we see up there is an attempt to repair the damage, and that is reached when the court acquits Jacob Zuma of rape. The narrative then proceeds to stage 5, a renewed narrative equilibrium.
Now all is seemingly well in post-colonial utopia that South Africa is so desperately trying to achieve.
But what happens if we use the lens of a feminist body hermeneutic to read the spaces between the 4th and the 5th stages of Todorov's narrative theory in the narratives of Esther and of Kwesi? I would argue that a reinscription of the flesh and blood body happens in opposition to the politicized and narrative erasure. Reading through a feminist body hermeneutic causes us to pause, to consider the verse which the biblical text and socio-political locations urge readers to rather gloss over. Higgins and Silver urge readers to adopt feminist modes of reading. Feminist modes of reading rape and its cultural inscriptions help identify and demystify the multiple manifestations, displacements, and transformations of what amounts to an insidious cultural myth. In the process, they show how feminist critique can challenge the representations that continue to hurt women both in the courts
and on the streets. A feminist mode of reading challenges readers to consider epistemic violence and gendered physical violence
before we rush into the ethnic and political equilibrium which awaits us at the end of both narratives. What can Korea in its journey toward peace and reconciliation learn from these narratives? Both the biblical and contemporary narrative show that in the scramble for reconciliation, racial, ethnic, gender, and otherwise, the wounded bodies of women are often erased. A feminist body hermeneutic of the body challenges us to reinscribe the wounded bodies so that reconciliation is comprehensive and not facile. As Audre Lorde has reminded us, Black women's literature is full of the pain of frequent assault, not only by a racist patriarchy, but also by Black men. Yet the necessity for and history
of shared battle have made us, Black women,
particularly vulnerable to the false accusation that being anti-sexist is being anti-Black. Meanwhile, women-hating as a recourse of the powerless is sapping strength from Black communities and our very lives. Rape is on the increase, reported and unreported, and rape is not aggressive sexuality. It is sexualized aggression. A feminist theology of the wounded body for reconciliation offers us 4 important points for further deliberation and consideration, and I conclude with this chair. 1, that the female body is not a means to an end, but an end in itself. 2, that the female body is not a necessary evil, but a gift from God. Overcoming dualistic notions of body and mind is crucial here. 3, the wounded body of women can be read in juxtaposition with the wounded body of Christ. The wounds of Christ, too, are glossed over in traditional Christologies, because the wounds are associated with a salvific effect and not with protest leading to reconciliation. As Megan McKenna remarks, to say that Jesus died for our sins is only half a theology. It is to forget that he was executed because he was dangerous to a society that wanted to hold on to its power. 4, in the quest for a theology of reconciliation, it is important to reinscribe the body in the discourse. As Sharon Bong says, a theology that matters is a theology that is embodied, and a theology that is embodied is sound theology. In the journey towards peace and reconciliation here in South Korea, the question I leave you with is, whose bodies are being erased, vilified, forgotten, and silenced? Thank you.
뉴욕의 유니온 신학대학원에서 가르쳤던 그 필리스 트리블이라고 하는
학자의 책 제목이 바로 텍스트 오브 테러, 한국어로도 번역되어 있는 그 제목을 이름을 가지고 성서 안에서 우리가 그저 무비판적으로 읽었던 에스더 이야기와 또 남아공에서 한 여성의 이야기를 서로 같이 읽어 나가시면서 저는 이 말이 마음에 깊이 남았습니다. 상처받은 여성의 육체가 가부장적이고 민족적인 희생을 받았는데 화해의 조급함 앞에서 또 다른 평형을 이루기 위해서 그냥 해피엔딩을 만들기 위해서 여성의 육체와 고통을 간과하고 지나가 버리는 그런 화해는 진정한 화해가 아니라는 것을 성서 텍스트의 이야기와 오늘의 남아공 이야기를 가지고 우리 앞에 너무도 강렬하게 제기해 주셨습니다. 화해를 위한 조급함에 저희가 서둘지 말고 그 화해를 이뤄가는 데 있어서 우리가 반드시 경청하고 짚고 넘어가야 될 아픔과 상처가 무엇인지 돌아보게 해주신 귀중한 발제에 진심으로 감사를 드립니다. 요즘 한국 사회에서도 잘 아시지만 미투 위드 유 운동이 일어나고 있고 얼마 전에 그 서지현 검사가 용감하게 그것을 증언해서 그 운동이 이루어지고 있고 제가 가르치는 대학에서도 지금 여러 그 남자 교수들의 잘못된 언행에 관한 여러 심판들이 이루어지고 있는데 밖에서 볼 때는 그것이 무질서로 보일지 모르겠습니다만 안에서는 시간이 걸리더라도 아픔을 치유하고 2차 피해가 발생하지 않게 차곡차곡 그런 일을 해가고 있는 것을 제가 보고 있는데 다시 한번 우리 평화와 화해를 이루어가는 길에서 우리가 반드시 명심하고 또 보아야 될 그 점을 보게 해주신 우리 선생님께 다시 한번 큰 박수를 보내주시면 고맙겠습니다.
또한 아울러 역시 세 번째 스피커도 시간을 너무 잘 지켜주셔서 제가 조금 더 하셔도 될 것 같은데 시간을 줄여주셔서 제가 이렇게 세상에 태어나 이렇게 행복한 사회자가 또 있을 수 있을까 생각합니다. 자, 마지막 네 번째로 스피커가 나오시겠습니다. 맥스 에디거 선생님이시고 발제 제목은 분쟁 극복과 역사화해 치유를 위한 민간단체 역할인데 맥스 에디거 선생님은 종교간 협력 포럼의 설립위원이시고
아시아 평화학교 설립자이시자 베트남과 미국의 평화를 위해 활동한 평화운동가이십니다. 큰 박수로 그의 발제를 맞아 듣겠습니다.
Okay, thank you very much for your introduction. And my thanks to all of you for giving me the opportunity to be here. I've lived in Asia most of my life, And so I tell people that Asia has been my university. What I share is what I've learned and experienced here. And some of the teachers who have inspired me very much are sitting in this room. So my thanks to you. My experience during most of my working life has been an involvement with informal marginalized groups and movements committed to social change for just peace. These marginalized groups include poor rural peasants, slum communities fighting for land rights, refugees, and victims of violence and war. I believe strongly in a bottom-up approach to building communities of peace and justice, and I firmly believe that the marginalized are one of the main subjects of peace building. My sharing today will be about some of the lessons I have learned from these experiences and a little of how I have attempted to apply these learnings to my more recent work with interfaith youth and the movement to confront ethnic and religious violence. I hope it can be of some benefit to our discussions regarding marginalized people as significant actors in building communities of just peace. In the 1960s, as the US war in Vietnam raged, I was deeply involved in the anti-war movement on my college campus, where I was an active member of our Peace Club and wrote articles for the college paper. After graduation, I went to Vietnam with my church organization, the Mennonite Central Committee, to work with refugees and to write about the realities of this unjust war against the people of Vietnam. I remained there from 1971 to 1976, and I would just add I was privileged to be there 1 year after the war ended to observe how the changes were taking place. During these years of protest, tens of thousands of people all around the US and around the world in general were mobilized to speak out against the war and the establishment that fueled it. People gathered on university campuses, in front of the White House, Washington, D.C., and on streets and cities throughout the country to march, sing, and call for a new society. It was an exhilarating time. The energy was high, and the determination to change our society was strong. We felt that nothing could stop us. On April 30th, 1975, the war did end, and shortly after that, the compulsory military draft in the USA also ended. Shockingly, the vast movement for social change that we could mobilize at a moment's notice also began to fade as people went back to their normal lives, raising a family, earning a salary, and building a comfortable life. There were, of course, those who stayed with the struggle, and many are still active today, but the number's small. Several years later, I visited an activist friend in Chicago who took me around to see some of the struggles still going on in the city. One stop was in a beautiful neighborhood with tree-lined streets, upscale coffee shops, and well-kept apartment buildings. Being unclear why he brought me to this place, I asked, what is the reason? This used to be a slum, he replied. When many young, upward mobile working people saw that land was cheap and the old buildings had character, they pushed the poor out and then restored the community for their own luxury living. Who are these people who forced out the poor so they could have a new community to live in, I asked, feeling a bit angry. The residents here are the very people we marched side by side with to protest the war, the status quo, racism, and other forms of injustice. They now have become the very thing they were fighting against. I was shocked. How could our very vigorous movement for social justice suddenly go so wrong? This was the start of my search to find the answer to why movements for just peace societies are often not sustained for a long period of time. If I could find an answer, then I would work more effectively. As we say in our movement, don't be busy, be effective. I want to be effective. My search took me on a working pilgrimage to Burundi, Africa, Vietnam, Thailand, Hong Kong, and now Cambodia. Along the journey, I had many teachers, people living desperate poverty, men and women working on Patpong Street in Bangkok's famous red light district, slum dwellers, factory workers, rural peasants, refugees, and victims of war. They taught me that listening to the poor and oppressed is more important than speaking to them, that we must start with what the people already have, instead of introducing new theories and models of peacemaking to them, that inclusion and transparency are essential to gain the trust of the poor and oppressed, and most importantly, that they must be included at the table as equals, not just as labor. I also learned from them that no matter how many thousands of people gather to change the world, if they are not serious about changing themselves, they can never change society. Change begins with me, and I must have the courage to first address that responsibility. This kind of change is called transformation, as it is a radical move away from what I am now toward what I can and should be. As I transform myself, I can begin to join with the oppressed to transform the world. Paulo Freire said that we only transform ourselves when we experience reality, reflect deeply on it, and act to change that which is unjust. He called this the action-reflection praxis. In order for us to sustain our involvement in social transformation, it is important that we learn from our own actions and not just from the theories and models of others. We must experience the real life of the poor and oppressed and then reflect on it to learn and to change. We also need to look at our own life experiences and reflect on them for the lessons they teach us. We need to go out into the world of injustice and pain, live with those who are suffering, and then reflect on the root causes of this suffering so that we can work long-term for the transformation of the social, economic, and political roots of injustice. This action and reflection praxis then must result in new actions based on what we have experienced and learned, followed up with new reflection. This is an ongoing process. Paulo Freire suggested that it is not enough for the poor and oppressed to come together in dialogue in order to gain knowledge of their social reality. They must act together upon their environment in order critically to reflect upon their reality and so transform it through further action and critical reflection. As I have worked to encourage and support young activists who will take on the very difficult task of building new societies of just peace, I now recognize that the first important step is in their willingness to change themselves, their attitudes, their approaches to injustice, their focus on the future, and their relationships to the different classes in our society. These kinds of changes do not happen because we tell the youth they must change, or when we fill their head with theories and models for social transformation. It happens through involving them in a long, long process of action and reflection, which gives them opportunity to identify with those who struggle for survival, and also helps them recognize what changes they need to make in themselves. Another important lesson I have learned is that people who have been marginalized and oppressed are, in most cases, not victims, but rather the most important actors in the struggle against oppressive forces and structures. In the 1990s, I worked a lot with the victims of war in Burma. That war had driven hundreds of thousands of indigenous villagers either into border refugee camps or as internally displaced persons deep into the jungles where they were hiding from the military. In one discussion with a small group of Korean villagers, I talked of the internally displaced persons as victims of the war. One young Korean man was visibly upset by what I was saying. Finally, he said in frustration, "Don't talk about the IDPs as victims. They are not victims. By hiding in the jungle, they are fighting back in their own way to prevent the military from controlling them. You need to recognize that they have their own tradition of struggle. Don't interfere in their process of struggle, but rather find a way to support it." These words challenged me to look more carefully at how I view those under the heel of oppression and whether I was being an asset or an obstacle to their struggle. Do I understand and trust them enough to allow them to lead me along with them in their struggle? Now, when working with marginalized youth, I no longer introduce the latest theories of conflict transformation or the best-known models of peacemaking to them. Rather, I encourage youth to go back to their own experiences, their people's history, their cultures, and their religious traditions, to find the best forms of nonviolent struggle, which are part of their community's life experience. That is where they must start seeking the way of struggle, which their people can understand and can participate in with confidence. In other words, they already have everything they need to begin building communities of interfaith justice. Once they are firmly rooted in their own community's experience and knowledge, they can benefit from learning of other models and theories without destroying their own people's justice processes. An important concept I learned from the men and women is that if you want to help those who are different or have a different life experience, you must learn to empathize with them. Empathy is a difficult challenge for most of us. In Thailand, they describe empathy as taking the heart of the other and placing it in your own heart. How can I take the heart of a prostitute, an IDP, an LGBTQ person, a child victim of the war in Yemen, a woman who has been raped, or a child soldier, and place their heart in my heart when I have never had those experiences? In the programs I work with, we encourage participants to go back to their communities and spend quality time with marginalized communities and individuals. This is much more serious than going to a slum for a couple of days to play games with the children and giving them some snacks. It requires more commitment than doing interviews with young people working in the red light district and then writing articles or maybe a book about them. It necessitates much more commitment than signing a few statements condemning injustice by our government officials or marching in the streets to protest the war in Yemen or Iraq. If we wish to develop empathy with the oppressed, we are compelled to integrate with them, listen deeply to their stories, and be willing to spend the time needed to begin to feel the pain in their lives, not with sympathy, but with empathy. How can these learnings help us find a way to ensure that the movements for justice and peace are sustained until they are firmly in place in our communities and our world? From these and many other experiences, I now believe that the key to building peace activists and that work effectively with the oppressed and who do not give up the struggle when they feel tired or discouraged can be found in one word: vision. It is very important that we develop in ourselves and in our social justice movement a deep and detailed vision of where we want to go. King Solomon in Proverbs 29:18 wrote that a people without a vision soon perish. Now I believe that our peace and social transformation movement in the 1960s weakened because it was based on a dream and not on a vision. We had a dream for world peace and a society that was not governed by greed and arrogance. But we did not clearly know what that world of peace would look like or what a new society would be founded upon. When the pressures people felt from the war in Vietnam ended and the possibility of moving on to a potentially prosperous and comfortable life emerged, the dream faded and in too many cases simply ended. If we wish our movement for peace and justice to remain dynamic and to keep the flame of hope and determination alive in the people, we must work to move the dream in our mind to a vision within our soul. That vision will give us a very clear and detailed picture, like a blueprint of what we are building and the detailed steps we need to make the building complete. This is not an academic process, it is a spiritual process that impacts our souls in ways which make it very difficult to step away from becoming normal human beings. begin. We become focused on what we can be, and we stand with the oppressed as one of them to help move toward the vision. Aristotle said, educating the mind without educating the heart is no education at all. Educating the mind can give us dreams, but when we move our dreams from our head to our hearts, we move to vision. And vision compels us to move to transformation. Transformation of self and transformation of the injustices around us. If the marginalized are to be one of the main subjects of peace building, then we must work with them, as with ourselves, to nurture the growth of a vision in our souls that has no expiry date. I would suggest that nurturing such a vision requires much time and patience. We cannot rush it by trying to fill the mind with many new and exciting ideas. We must move slowly, step by step, allowing the marginalized to act and reflect so that they begin to see their reality more clearly and see a hopeful process for transforming it. For ourselves, we must spend ample time with the marginalized so that we can begin to feel their pain and anger. Only then might we be able to empathize with them and move from leaving them as victims to joining them in their struggle as the important actors in the process of transformation. And above all, let us not ignore the potential of the youth to lead us towards a new and just society. We need the idealism of the youth as well as the experience of the older generation. We must all come together in mutual respect and teamwork. I urge us to stand firmly with the marginalized, especially with the marginalized youth, as the struggle for true peace and justice continues. Thank you.
제가 대학에서 가르치지만 학생들이 교수를 두 가지로 구분합니다. 하나는 선생이고 두 번째는 꼰대입니다. 선생은 이제 단순하게 지식의 전달자가 아니라 옆에서 그 학생이 하나의 주체로 자라나도록 격려해주고 기다려주고 공감해주고 지지해주고 하는 그런 그 프로페서를 선생님이라고 부르고요. 어떻게 하든지 너는 바뀌어야 돼. 너는 이것을 고쳐야 돼. 그래서 끊임없이 지적질을 하고 자기가 옳다고 갑질하는 선생님을 꼰대라고 부르는데 어느 선생님께서는 우리가 평화를 만드는 과정에서도 꼰대가 아니라 진정한 선생이 되어야 되는 것이 아닌가 하는 얘기를 그냥 이론으로 주신 게 아니라 평생 미국인인데 고난받는 현장을 돌아다니면서 어떻게 하면 바닥에 있는 가난한 사람들의 신뢰를 받을 수 있을까 평생 동안 고민했던 그 경험에서 나오는 말씀을 주셔서 너무 좋았습니다. 네 분의 스피커가 모두가 다 우리들에게 지식 전달자가 아니라 우리에게 새로운 그 비전을 갖게 만드는 통찰을 주신 분이라고 하는 점에서
제가 경험한 그 어느 국제회의보다 이 회의가 정말 풍성하고 아름답습니다. 말씀을 듣다 보니까 왜 남미 해방신학자들이 왜 the epistemological privilege of the poor라고 해서 가난한 사람들이 갖고 있는 인신론적인 특권이란 말을 했던 단어가 기억합니다. 제 장모님이 초등학교 밖에 못 나오신 분인데 가끔 밤 9시 뉴스를 보다 보면 제가 깜짝깜짝 놀랍니다. 그 복잡한 세계 정세를 듣다가 저 트럼프 뭐 하자는 거지? 평생 바느질을 해서 두 아이를 키운 저희 장모님께서는 세상의 위정자들이 말하는 또 언론이 말하는 그 아름다운 수사 뒤에 숨어 있는 것을 한마디로 간파해내시는 걸 볼 때마다 배웠다는 제가 참 부끄러워지는데 그게 바로 가난한 자들이 갖고 있는 인신론적 특권이고 그것을 신뢰하고 그것에 공감하고 그들이 우리의 대상이 아니라 주체가 되도록 기다려주고 그리고 단순한 꿈이 아니라 비전을 갖게 하는 그것이 우리가 미니 평화의 주체가 되게 만드는 데 있어서 정말 필요한 것이 아닌가 이런 통찰을 주신 것 같아서 또한 감동이었습니다. 또 감동은 네 번째 스피커 역시 시간을 많이 남겨주셔서
오늘 우리가 또 여유 있게 더 질문하고 또 식사할 수 있는 시간을 주셨다는 것을 다시 한번 진심으로 감사드립니다. 제가 마음 같아서는 지금 뭐 질의응답을 조금 바꾸시고 싶지만 예정된 시간이 있으므로 지금부터 또 10분에서 4시까지 쉬시고 돌아오셔서 이거는 이제 5분의 짧은 15분씩 발표를 듣고 그리고 나서 여러분들에게 궁금했던 거 나누고 싶었던 거 함께 나누는 그런 시간을 갖도록 하겠습니다. 여러분 이 4분의 발표자들에게 다시 한번 큰 박수로 감사를 드리겠습니다.
나도 얘기가 없어가지고 영어가 원래